end of 2008, Ghana's total debt was 9.5 billion cedis. 10 years down the line, end of 2018, our debt has risen to 173 billion cedis. I'm sure you can calculate the growth, right? That's like 1,700 and something %. Assuming we hold other things constant and go at the same pace in the next 10 years, can you imagine where we will be in terms of the percentages? That would be quite interesting, isn't it? So look at this. This is West Africa. And the point we are trying to make here is that we have made the IMF more popular than the IMF itself. So this is West Africa. So you have Liberia. That is a record holder in West Africa in terms of the number of times they have gone to the IMF for a fund-supported program, 21 times. They joined in 1962. So you can just look at from 1962 to 2018 and then divide that by the number of times they've gone there, and you'll find that in less than 2 years perhaps. So I'm sure as we are speaking right now, they are there. Right. So you want to look at that, compare that also to Sierra Leone, Mali, and then you find our beloved country, Ghana. We have been there 16 times, and I'm sure our next visit is as close as next year's election. And we understand why that statement is fundamental. So we can move on to, then you can look at Southern Africa, Malawi being a record holder, followed by Zambia. Central African Republic, you can see DR Congo, that has been there 13 times, and then the other countries as well. Let's look at Sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps. So this is also Northern Africa, Morocco being a record holder. They joined in 1958, they've been there 20 times. Eastern Africa, you can talk about Kenya, that has also been there 19 times. And this is Sub-Saharan Africa. Liberia being a record holder, followed by Kenya, and then you can find Sierra Leone, Mali, Ghana, Senegal, and all of that. Look at where Nigeria is here. Nigeria has been there 4 times. This is Nigeria. In terms of the geographics, we are neighbors, but on this graph, we are far apart in terms of the number of times we've all been there. The reason I started off this way is that you will find that the template almost all these countries have sent to the IMF, you will find debt as an issue. That we have struggled as a continent, we have struggled as individual countries in managing our debt. And the reason we have struggled have more to do with the fact that we haven't been able to generate sufficient tax revenue to meet our needs. Our wants are many, and the wants, you want to look at them in terms of the expenditures government will have to incur, and yet we are unable to generate a lot of tax revenue to be able to meet that. So Ghana officially joined the IMF on September 20th, 1957. It wasn't long after that our problems started. How did it start? So we started to grow. We started spending because we had our independence. We decided to expand infrastructure. We were not generating a lot of tax revenue. So the only way out was to go and borrow. From perhaps a very little amount, end of 1960, our public debt as a country had risen to over $500 million by the end of 1965. We had problems managing that. So the only solution we could find was to head to the IMF. So our first approach to the IMF was actually in 1965, led by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. After the program had been designed, he rejected it, simply because, of course, like others have said, the IMF has got one medicine for every sickness: cut. Fiscal consolidation. These were inconsistent with the expansionary fiscal drive of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, so he rejected it. It wasn't long his government was overthrown. Right after that, 1966, we went to the IMF, and we have been there 16 times. When you look at the statistics, it means that every 3 years and a few months, or so since independence, or averagely every 4 years, we have had to go to the IMF. So this table is just to tell you, I'm sure these are not people's date of birth. These are periods that we have gone to the IMF. So you can talk about right after the overthrow, 1966, and then when we ended it, 1967, 68, 69, 79, actually the year I was born. So 83, 84 in that order. Then you can find the latest one we went, that was just April 2015 that we completed December 2008. Interestingly, colleagues, let's look at the templates that necessitated our going to the IMF, the first visit that we didn't accept at the end of the day. These were the reasons: deteriorating economic conditions occasioned by unfavorable development in commodity prices, namely gold, cocoa, ballooning public debt from a very small amount to over $500 million by 1965, deteriorating external reserves. Our external reserves was positive to the tune of $269 million. That was 1957. By the end of 1965, our reserves had gone down to a negative $391 million, reflecting a huge balance of payment problems. Once you see your reserves in this situation, then it was going to be very difficult to continue to import, because the bulk of import is done on credit. So we had to head to the fund. Then, so remember, prior to 1963, we were using the West African pound. We didn't have control over printing of currencies and all of that. So we abandoned that and then introduced our own CD. In July 1965, we started printing our own CD the way we wanted. So look at the real effect of that. Inflation then jumped from 0.98% in 1965 to 26.4% by the end of 1965. It means we were heading dangerously. And I'm sure you can understand why the CD continues the way it does, and I'm wondering why some people will put their integrity on it, because the CD will depreciate. If we can pray a little bit more, we can do all of that, but we still expect that the CD will lose some value, especially as the election also approaches. So when you look at the value of the CD when it was introduced in 1965 to date, I mean, and you compare that to the value of the dollar, the CD has lost approximately 99.99% of its value. The reason we can't get to 100% is because mathematically it ceases to exist once you reach that point. And of course, one will have a currency, isn't it? So that's how interesting it is for all of us. So we went through all of this. So 1966, we had some kind of debt reduction. We managed that. And then in the 70s, so we had struggled. Essentially, we have struggled since independence to manage our debts. And of course, you also remember what happened with the famous Yempia by General Champon in early 1970s. I mean, it was as serious as that. It was also interesting to know the reasons Champon cited for the decision that he took, because to him, others believe that most of those debts were procured with fraud and a whole lot of things. So there were serious challenges right from there. And the reason we haven't been able to do this is because it has been difficult for us as a country to achieve sustainable fiscal consolidation over a long period. And the reason that has been difficult is because of revenue challenges and expenditure rigidities. One basic function of the state is to collect taxes. Any country that is inefficient in collecting sufficient taxes in the face of rising expectation for improved services, infrastructure development, the need to drive balanced growth and all of that, will end up in a debt trap. It's as simple as that. Those countries that have made it because they were efficient at collecting taxes. And by the time we are done, we'll be able to understand why there is a need to scale up in terms of our efforts in collecting more taxes, because our tax potential is very huge. And all that we needed to do is to be able to convert that into actual. So we went through the 80s and all of that. Then towards the end of 2000, our debt was life-threatening. So if we relate our debt to GDP, we're talking about close to 130%. We're spending more than 60% of our tax revenue just to service our debt. And here we are talking about a debt that was as low as 32% of GDP in 1990. And this has risen to over 100% by the end of 2000. We found salvation in HIPIC, and I'm sure we are all familiar with HIPIC, which we finished in 2004, and then the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative that we also finished in 2006. So with HIPIC, debt servicing suspended, we had some kind of fiscal space. They even told us how we should use that money. We use some in building KVIPs, we use some in so many other things, schools. I hope you're able to use one of those KVIPs during your time. Okay. So we achieved a combined debt relief, which of over $4 billion. By the time we're done, our debt to GDP ratio came to less than 30%. That meant we had fiscal space to scale up infrastructure investment. We could actually inject growth through debt financing. That was what that meant. So with this fiscal space, remember that towards the end of 2006, with this fiscal space, Ghana actually filed for a divorce from the IMF. We wanted to be on our own. This was in 2006. So we also need to highlight those good news. So we wanted to be on our own, and it wasn't so difficult for the IMF to approve that. So we exited the Poverty Reduction and Growth Facility in 2006. Less than 3 years, we went back to the IMF when we made a very huge U-turn in July 2009. So between July 2009 and July 2012, we were effectively under the IMF program. Less than 4 years after that, we went back again to the fund. So this is just to give us some historical, this graph I picked from a colleague. Okay, so you can see how our debt to GDP ratio has been over the years. So in the year 2000, and then it came down. So you can see from this period to this period, it came down significantly. It started climbing up. So let's go to the next slide. So look at this. So I'm sure this table captures two major political parties in this country. So we want to be fair to both. Okay. So look at our external debt in cities. Domestic debt, then you can talk about the total debt. So end of 2014, our total public debt was approximately 80 billion cedis. This increased to a little above 100 billion by the end of 2015. So you can see 2016, the figure for 2016, 122.3 billion cedis. 2017, 42.6 billion, and then end of 2018 we have 73 billion cedis. I'm sure with this you can just look at the growth rate. So what is the point here? The understanding is that regardless of which party is in power, we have been what? Borrowing. So when it comes to debt and its sustainability, I think we should be able to put our political ideologies or whatever aside and look at it objectively, because this will not discriminate. The real effect of this will illustrate in the subsequent slides as we go. Then in dollar terms, you can also see what we have been doing. So this is just to tell us the rate at which we have been adding to the public debt. And let me say that when you look at the 2018 figure, it also went up significantly because of the financial sector bailouts. So we have had to spend close to 13 billion cedis just to clean up the financial sector. And that has added to that stuff. So when you take that out of the 173, you're looking at a reduced figure. So we can talk about the public debt excluding the financial bailout, and then the public debt inclusive of the financial bailout. So you can see the rate of growth of the debt from 2013 to 2014 was almost 50% in terms of the growth. And you can understand why this is so, because we had our 2012 elections with a huge fiscal deficit that has to be financed. We had the energy crisis that affected the real sector of the economy and also affected our ability to generate a lot of tax revenue. So it went up sharply. Then we went for the IMF program. And the reason this is important is that one key objective of the IMF program was to restore debt sustainability, because it was an issue. In the subsequent slides, we'll show the effect which has remained with us. Even though the current government seems to be doing something about it, we are not seeing the real benefit of that prudent debt management, all of that, because the base is already very huge. And once we continue to run a deficit, the deficit is an indication of the borrowing requirement of the government. So that declined in terms of the rate of debt accumulation to 26% in 2015, 22% in 2016, and then 16.6% in 2017. So you can see that this is like some good news for us, right? So even though the rate of accumulation is decreasing because the base is huge, in nominal terms, what do we see? It's going up. Okay. But at least this is telling us some positive trend that perhaps we can note down. Then you can see 2018, excluding the financial bailout, it decreased to 14.5%. Inclusive of the financial sector bailout, it's gone to 21.4%. So the difference between 14.5% and 21.4% has to do with the mess that needed to be cleaned up in the financial sector. And it's now the burden is on the taxpayer, isn't it? So this slide is also to tell us the development from 2014 to 2016. The bulk of this, you can find it from the debt management reports. So we decided to use official data because that is what we can verify. We don't want to speculate as much as possible. But of course, there are other developments that are not captured here in terms of some agreements, some arrangements that maybe, depending on the party you belong to, it looks like debt. And if you are not in that party, it looks like it's a barter system or something. We don't, it's one debt. It's public debt. It doesn't have to become multiple choice. It has to be one debt for all of us. So you can see from 2014, okay, so before rebasing, you can see 70.2% 2014, 73.2% 2015, 73.1% 2016, 69.3% 2017. So all GDP series, we are talking about 71.6% for end of 2018. Then when we look at it based on the new GDP series, you can see that our debt to GDP ratio has come down. That is not to suggest that we don't have the debt. And so like the moderator said, so we have had to scale the public debt by a new base, which is very huge, and that dwarfs the debt to GDP ratio. But again, that same arrangement betrays us significantly when we look at other debt sustainability indicators like debt service to revenue ratio. That does not respond necessarily to the rebasing. And rebasing is nothing, it's as simple as using a different calculator to do the mathematics and say, hey, suddenly you are rich, but you didn't have the cash flow. We had done this in 2009. And that was how come suddenly we became rich, a middle income country, but then at a lower level. So our strategy was to consolidate our middle income status. But we didn't have that cash flow. We started spending as though we were rich, but we were not. So we did single spine, you remember? Okay. Before that, we were on several spines, and it looks like it was okay. Then we said, let's collapse everything into one spine. And that spine is really taking on a lot now. And that is how interesting it is now. So, based on the new GDP series, this is what we have. But colleagues, this certainly creates a certain false impression that our debt is a bit sustainable because debt to GDP ratio itself is not really a good measure of a country's debt sustainability because so you scaled your public debt by GDP and somebody will ask you, so how do you manage it? You can drive this down either by reducing the numerator in terms of the public debt or by expanding the denominator, which is this. But of course, there's no requirement that we should pay off all our debt with 1 year's output because we borrow against what? Future cash flows. So that is why beyond the debt to GDP ratio, there are other debt sustainability indicators that tell that tend to act like asset tests for any country. And then in dollar terms, we can also see what we are having here. So we have been talking about reprofiling our public debt to create some fiscal space it didn't start with this government. In fact, it started with the previous government, but this government has also continued consistent with our debt management strategy, which I believe was also born out of the latest, the just ended IMF program. So this is the effect of that. So in terms of the cost of having all this debt on our books, which we will call the weighted average interest cost on our interest rate on our debt. So you can see for external debt, okay, 4.3%, 4.3 here and there. But look at the domestic debt. Okay, so we used to do averagely, right, and then taking into consideration the maturity profile of the debt. So we're talking about, we used to do 20%, 2016, it came down to 17.4%, 16.5%, and then in terms of the total debt, it went down from 11.3% to 10.6%, but you will see that in nominal terms, the interest payment is actually what? Going up because the base has also increased. But the effect of the debt management strategy, reprofiling and all of that is that we are not reducing the weighted average cost of our overall debt, which I think is very good. But then of course you can also see that because of the constraints coming from the fact that the revenue side is not responding to the various policies that have been prescribed, the rate at which we are reducing this is very, very small. But at least it shows some good reason. Then again, the strategy was to lengthen the maturity profile. So you can see how the average time to maturity has also changed in the last couple of years, and then in terms of the risk that we are exposed to with all of this. So I'm sure you'll be interested in terms of the external debt, in which currencies they are denominated. And that is why when the cedi is depreciating against the dollar, we'll be concerned. If you are with the debt management unit at Ministry of Finance, it has implication for the country. So the bulk of the external debts are actually denominated in USD. Even the SDR is settled ultimately in the USD. So then you can find the other currencies. From there you have the euro, and then we have the sterling, the Japanese yen, and then the others. The others here with the other currencies. So you can fill this depending on. Yeah. Then, so for 2018, you can also find the composition of the external debts. So this tells you that when the cedi depreciates against the dollar, it has implication for us, isn't it? So there's a certain portion of the debts at any point in time that you can attribute to variation in the currency or in the exchange rates. So when you market to market, you can see the effect of that. Then again, so until 2007, the bulk of our debts were coming from bilateral, multilateral. But since then, we have been doing a lot of commercial borrowings from private investors, from investors. I'm sure if there's any debt forgiveness again, maybe we'll apply, but it may not be that easy for this component, because with these investors in our Eurobonds, forgiveness of sins is not in their literature book. So we should have to take our debt management seriously, because we may not be able to do that. So we've done a lot more of Eurobond from the international capital market, and then you can also look at what is coming from the multilateral and then the bilateral serving countries. Then interest rate structure of the external debt, I'm sure you'll also be interested, okay? So we have some debt that are carrying fixed interest rates, and then you can have the proportion of that, and then variable rates, and then interest-free. So you see, interest-free is very, very small. Of course, we are no longer poor, isn't it? So now we are rich, so we should be able to borrow from where rich people borrow. And then you can look at what is turning out for 2018 as well. So the idea is that Ghana has had a record history of fiscal indiscipline. And that is what largely is accounting for this debt buildup. Achieving fiscal discipline has been very, very difficult for us. Sometimes it's as difficult as asking fish to climb a tree. The results of that fiscal indiscipline is what turns into fiscal deficits that is linked to debt unsustainability. Over the past 30 years, the average fiscal deficit we have achieved as a country has been around 6.5% of GDP, and that is very high. deficit itself is not a sin. It's not a crime. The size relative to, let's say, GDP, and then the persistence, and the source, and the financing is what creates the problem. So once you see that consistency over a certain period of time, then it becomes a worry for us. And because the deficit tends to escalate during election years, that is where the problem is. So it means that election years' fiscal deficits are politically motivated. And the source of that spending is not productivity growth. So sometimes you find that so many things happen in the last 4 months of every competitive election. Sometimes it is safe to conclude, I'm sure the political scientists are here, that in the last 4 months of every competitive election in this country, nobody manages anything. It's like the country is left, yeah. So we suddenly come back to ourselves after the election, then we start counting the cost, and then the deficit balloons. So there are roads that were done in the night, 1 week to election. We did the roads during the day and we couldn't do it well. How would the night help us? So there are some roads that were done in the night in 2016. I'm sure when you go there right now, you will not really see that there was road. Something has taken it away. Okay. So the size of the deficit is important. The persistence, the source, the financing, they are very, very important. So in the time past, we have sought to finance the deficit from the central bank in terms of the budget financing. And that is equivalent to physically printing more cedis. And a good way to make your currency cheaper is to print more of it. So we had the Bank of Ghana Act that says that the central bank will finance the deficit to the tune of 10% of government's total revenue. The good news, colleagues, is that we never complied with it. So even though the law says 10%, according to a very beautiful lecture Dr. Baumia gave when he was in opposition, I'm sure at that time he had a lot of time. He did a lot of, he gave us a lot to think about and all of that. So in that lecture, he told us that the deficit financing from the central bank, instead of it being 10%, was actually 45% in 2012. And it was 35.4% in 2013. The IMF, in their recent publication, has put the average deficit financing to about 22%. So in other words, we had our own laws that we observe more in breach than in compliance. And I'm sure you understand why the just ended IMF program sought to deal with this particular problem by ensuring zero financing of the deficit from the central bank. And this was done to eliminate the excessive fiscal dominance of monetary policy. Because one key requirement for inflation targeting to be effective is to have fiscal discipline. Once you deny the central bank the fiscal discipline, then there's no way they can deploy monetary policy effectively to reduce inflation and engineer growth. Then what would have done is just to reduce monetary policy to just a broom to sweep the mess created through the physical side. So the fund sought to deal with that, and that is how come they put the zero financing, even though Ghana's parliament actually capped it at 5%. And I'm sure we decided to obey the IMF rather than our own laws, right? So we're still doing the zero financing from the central bank. So the fiscal deficit is an indication of the borrowing requirements of the government. And fiscal deficit is linked to debt unsustainability, especially if it's beyond a certain percentage of the GDP, and then its persistence as well. So let's look at how the deficits come about and then the effect of the elections. So you see these red lines are actually telling us when we had competitive elections, right? So you can talk about 1992, 1996, this is 2000, right? So you can see the deficits. Okay. So when we go through this expensive election, highly commercialized and monetized, then we spend the subsequent years to clear the mess. In the time past, we were taking 2 years to clear the mess, and then the next 2 years to start doing something about our lives. Then the next one, but now it's taking us more than 2 years. In fact, it's taking us more than 4 years now. So we haven't been able actually to clear the entire mess that was created in 2012. And I'm sure we are all aware that we went for the latest IMF program because of the twin deficits, current account deficit and then fiscal what? Deficit. The fiscal deficit in 2012 was 12.1% of GDP. And that was an issue. So you can see 2008. So I'm sure, depending on the party you belong to, you can associate with all this, isn't it? So we have seen the MPP here, we have seen the NDC also here. So there are some things that do not change, regardless of which party is in power. And we have to be able to look at them objectively. So this graph may not tell the entire story, but look at this. We said that there's nothing wrong to have a deficit, but it's much more a serious thing when you say you will do X, or your deficit will be X, and you end up doing X squared. That's where the indiscipline comes from. Okay. And then it's very difficult for the market to trust you. It's very difficult for government then to have the necessary policy credibility. Okay. So look at, so 2000, we said we will do this deficit. We said we will do this deficit. We ended up doing what? This. So just look at the variation, the level of what? Indiscipline. So you can see that, of course, 2004, we can say it's an outlier because of also HAPEC reliefs, and then the fact that the election really wasn't that competitive compared to the other years. So again, you can see the deficit mirrors that temperature. So once the political temperature also goes up, our tendency to overspend also goes up. And that is why we all have a role to play in moderating the political temperature. Then you can look at 2008, what we said we would do and where we ended up. You can look at 2012 and all of that. So, I mean, it's as serious as that. So this level of indiscipline tends to cost the country a lot. And don't forget that these are arrears that will have to be financed in the subsequent years. And sometimes the source and the motivation for this deficit are politically motivated. They are not done necessarily to engineer productivity growth. And that is why anytime we have gone through these competitive elections, inflation tends to head up. And then we have been financing this also from the central bank over the years. Then you can look at average inflation, which also, again, what we say inflation target and then what we end up with. You can see the variation is also a bit higher when it comes to election years, periods. So let's just look at the 2015 program. The causes why we went there, we talked about the twin deficit, the fiscal deficit, and then the current account deficit. The fiscal deficit reflects also revenue underperformance and then high expenditure that's going into 2012 because of single spine. I believe that perhaps maybe it was appropriately designed, maybe implementation-wise, I'm sure we missed it somewhere along the line. So what was the objective? I'm not focusing on all the others. I'm just looking at this. It said to ensure a sizable and front-loaded fiscal adjustment to restore debt sustainability. That meant towards the end of 2014, debt was an issue. We were spending more than 40% of our tax revenue just to service our debts. And the rest goes to wages and salaries. Very soon we'll demonstrate where we are right now, because part of the borrowing government is doing is to also finance a little bit of consumption also. Because when we put all the statutory obligations together, they actually take all the domestic revenue we are able to generate by way of tax. So even for goods and services from government side, sometimes we have to support that with some kind of debt, and that is not good for us. So since the objective was also, one of the objectives was to restore debt sustainability, let's look at how we ended it from the IMF itself. So the IMF concludes the review and says that Ghana's risk of external and overall debt distress continue to be assessed as high. Essentially meaning that we are a high-risk debt distress country. That meant our probability of default Goes up a bit. And once you are a high-risk debt distressed country, then the understanding is that the perceived default is slightly higher, and investors will hold out for a higher protection from the perceived default by holding out for higher yields. Even with that, in the last Eurobonds we have done, we have managed to secure what we consider to be a favorable rate, and we have even had a little bit of get together over that. Okay. So again, we can see in terms of debt sustainability, when we look at debt to GDP ratio, we found a place to hide on the basis of what? Rebasing the economy. So you do the rebasing and your debt to GDP ratio is less than 60%, let's say 54%, or others will say, or let's say inclusive for financial sector bailout, you are talking about 56-57%. But that doesn't tell us all the story. It betrays us along certain areas. So now that Ghana is already a high-risk debt distressed country, based on the latest debt sustainability analysis done by the IMF and the International Development Association, there are other debt sustainability indicators that we should be mindful of. One of them is the external debt service to export ratio, which our performance is above the policy dependency threshold. So it means that we have breached that. So that is not in our favor. Again, when it comes to external debt service to revenue ratio, we have breached that. We are above the policy dependency threshold. You can talk about the present value of debt to public debt ratio, which we have also breached. Then more importantly, also debt service to revenue ratio, we have also breached that. And that is not good for us. And the real effect of the rising public debt without a corresponding expansion in the revenue envelope is the fact that we are spending more today to service our debt in terms of the interest payment when we relate that to revenue. And this is crowding out priority spending. Slides will soon show that Ghana is a record holder when it comes to the country in Sub-Saharan Africa that spends more of its tax revenue just to service its debt. We are doing more than 45%. And that is a problem for all of us. So when you add that, I'm sure we have slides to indicate that. So then again, you can also talk about present value of debt to export ratio and all of that. So in the last 2 years, actually, there's some good news that perhaps we can report. But ultimately, it doesn't reflect the way we should, because we have seen our trade balance being positive from 2017. So 2017, we had trade balance of about a little above $1 billion. And then 2018 also, we had trade balance. Theoretically, that should contribute to the strengthening of the local currency. But that is not happening because in the same balance of payment, you will find that when it comes to the income and services account, we are recording a huge outflow, which tends to drive the positive news from the trade balance. And that is what is putting pressure on the city as well. And then our international reserves. And so even though some of the indicators are relating it to export performance, the ownership structure in the export earnings is very, very low. And at the end of the day, we don't get to realize the intended benefit, for which reason we had all those things. So these are graphs to indicate where we are. So this is debt service to revenue ratio. This is the policy dependency threshold. This is where we are, way above. And this is not good. So look at this, Ghana in 2019. So from the budget, these are tax revenue, which is 45 billion cedis. Usually I wouldn't want to dwell much on the total domestic revenue because it also includes grants, right? How much are we getting from grant aid and those things? Just a little above 1 billion, isn't it? So Ghana beyond aid is just a logical outcome of where we find ourselves. Where is the aid in this graph? Can you see the aid in this graph? Look at 8%. Okay. So keep in mind how much we are hoping to generate this year by way of tax revenue, which is 45 billion cedis. And then look at the allocation function of the government. You know, all men are the same in their promises. It's only in our deeds that we differ, right? So we get to judge the true intention of government when it comes to how they allocate funds. Because the budget is maybe over 200 pages, but these two slides are very, very important. how much revenue we are going to generate, and then how we are going to what? Spend that. Is very, very important. So you can see the allocation function here for 2019. The biggest item here is compensation of what? Employees. How much is that? 23 billion cedis. How much are we able to generate by way of tax revenue? 45, right? So take 23 billion from 45 billion, we are left with what? Okay, beautiful. Keep in mind, then this is what? Interest what? Payment. Approximately 19 billion. This is the effect of the rising what? Debt. So this is how much we had to allocate for 2019 just to cover interest what? Payment. Remember, this is just the interest component on our debt. The principal repayment is not captured in this. That is done through rollover. And that is why when you see the public debt going up, some are for liability management. And a good example would be the latest Euro bond that we did. We got $3 billion, and then we're told that $2 billion will go into infrastructure financing, and $1 billion is set aside for liability what? Management. But there's always a base, and the base goes up gradually with every fiscal deficit that we record every year. So please, if you have your calculator here, so this 19 billion, this is approximately 23 billion, add these two and subtract it from 45 billion we are hoping to generate by way of tax revenue. How much do you have left? 3. Now let me tell you that this 3, you don't have it. You know why? So there is certainty with the interest payment. There is also certainty with what? But there is a lot of uncertainty about what? Tax revenue. Because this must respond to certain tax measures that are contained in the what? In the budget. And I'm sure since the budget was presented, a lot has happened, for which reason perhaps our revenue envelope will have to be taken second or so. So this is how interesting it is for us. So when you take these two out, you are left with, let's say, approximately 3 billion. But remember, these two are not the only statutory obligations. So we have GET fund, we have District Assembly Commonwealth fund, and all of that. So if government is on course with all 8 statutory obligations, then where do you think the rest of the money is coming from? Okay, I wasn't the one who said it. So, and this is not unique to this current government. It has been with us. It has been with us. And that is why we don't need to do politics about them. This is crowding out priority spending. And that is why, with this binding fiscal constraint, government is doing a lot more, should I say, financial engineering or whatever, but it comes down to excessive debt collateralization and revenue monetization. Okay, so what we are doing is that we are trying to fast forward future revenue to today. And that is part of the arrangement government is doing now with some of our natural resources, because we don't have the fiscal space to do infrastructure projects in this country. So we are doing many of this, and I want to believe that we have to be a bit careful about the way we are actually ring-fencing future revenue just to maybe meet today's needs. And then look at how much we set aside for capital spending, approximately 9 billion. Now, this is what we have observed over the period through our research. Anytime our revenue envelope does not respond to the policy measures, what gets sacrificed is how much we intend to spend on capital expenditure. Because you cannot do anything about the interest payment. We don't want to go into debt liquidation. We can't do anything about our salary. If you do anything to my salary, I will not go to class. But then, this is what gets sacrificed. Colleagues, any country that is not making sufficient provision towards capital spending, it has either concluded it doesn't have a future or it doesn't intend to take advantage of that. So what is happening now is that we are running down our our infrastructure that we are unable to maintain them. Because of the lack of fiscal space, we are also unable to expand our infrastructure base. And the huge infrastructure deficit further imposes restrictions on the growth drivers of the economy. And the reason the non-oil real sector of the economy has not responded the way it should also reflect the lack of appropriate spending when it comes to capital expenditure to ease the restrictions on the growth drivers of the economy. And this is a problem, and we have to do something about that. So, the reason we've had all these things is because, as a country, we are not collecting sufficient tax revenue. It's as simple as that. We started off by saying that one basic function of the state is to collect what? Taxes. Once we are not collecting sufficient tax revenue, and we have all these expenditures that we have to meet, then ultimately we have to borrow. It's as simple as that. So this is just a back of the envelope calculation. So if you look at Ghana's theoretical tax frontier, our tax potential is very, very huge. The calculation is giving us that we can actually do additional revenue mobilization of 89 billion cedis. I'm sure you're going to ask me, where is it going to come from? We'll demonstrate where it's going to come from. And it is possible. Because that is our potential. And the next stage is to convert our potential into what? Into actual. And work out. So, our tax effort, based on the new GDP series, is around 12.6%. Our peers are doing 24%. Our peers are doing 25%. And we are doing what? 12.6%. So the difference between 12.6% and what our peers are doing represents the potential that we should be able to take advantage of. When you do the calculations, you are talking about something in excess of 89 billion. So the calculation we have done suggests that Ghana can actually scale up in terms of revenue mobilization for between 5% to 12% of GDP, which will range from 18 billion cedis to 45 billion. The minimum, which is the 5%, is actually more than the total fiscal deficit in the 2019 budget, approximately 15 billion. In other words, if we're able to close the gap at the minimum level, then we wouldn't have the kind of deficit that we are accommodating in the budget. And why we are unable to do this, we can explain that through a number of reasons. One of them is tax exemptions. And to make matters simple for all of us, our president himself acknowledged that in the State of the Nation's address, that we are losing so much by way of tax exemptions. And I'm sure once it has gotten to that level, it means that we now have to take it seriously. When it comes to trade misinvoicing alone, studies have shown that Ghana loses more than $2 billion. This $2 billion we are losing through trade misinvoicing is approximately 67% of the total Eurobond we have done this year. And is 70% of the budget deficit for 2019. So I'm sure if a politician says that the money is here, that sounds familiar, right? Then that is true, isn't it? Yeah. So what is left is to go and find it. Okay, the money is here. Okay. So when you put other exemptions and all of that, a conservative estimate from all these exemptions put it at more than 10%. Others put it at 17% exemptions. So all that we needed to do is to rationalize the exemption regime. The good news is that we have heard that a new exemption bill has parliament. So I haven't read it. So I don't know what is in it and how it's going to help us. But certainly, so these exemptions, these multinationals, companies, firms are actually in tax-paying position. And they are using the same system to what? Make these savings. Apart from that, you can also see some level of sensitivity from the private sector corporate governance arrangement that changes anytime there's a major regime change. They reconstitute their boards, put the new guys in charge. Is it not true? Okay. So maybe we can do a study in that area to actually see how these things are done. So I'm sure when a couple of years ago, you don't need to write this, okay? So this is a gossip, okay? Nobody writes gossip. Gossip doesn't have a source. So a couple of years ago, when we heard that a certain portion of our Euro bond that we took, we had to send it to a certain bank to, and all of that. My concern wasn't the fact that we send the money there, but I was interested in who were on the boards of those words. And so when I saw the composition of the board, I knew it was possible. Okay. So it's not just one, but you'll find it, all over the place. Okay. So we talk about the rebate. So it means that there's actually potential when it comes to how much tax revenue we can generate. But the interesting thing also is that in the last 10 years or so, where our economy has expanded in terms of job creation, have come from the informal sector. And I'm sure it's been very difficult collecting sufficient taxes from those informal sector. So I believe that with the digitization that we are doing and all of that, I believe we all have to support, so we'll be able to collect sufficient tax revenue. So the issue is tax compliance, which we have to be able to. So the rebasing necessarily does not increase the cash flow available to the country. And we should not hide under rebasing to do a little bit more borrowing, because, and the other interesting thing we have to be able to demonstrate is to show that where those emerging subsectors from the economy that are actually necessitating this rebasing, how much tax revenue we are actually collecting from those emerging areas. That would be very, very interesting. Otherwise, it's not so much. So, because whilst it may show that debt to GDP ratio is fairly okay, debt service to revenue ratio and other indicators may not go in our favor. So we did that in 2009. We saw the effect. The latest one also is there for all of us to see. I hope you can see this graph a bit in terms of the budget outturn, provisional outturn. So I started from 2008, and then we can continue to 2018. So you can see tax revenue over this period. Then you can also see personnel emolument that has also been rising. Then look at interest payments. We're doing less than $1 billion. 2008, remember our total debt stock in 2008 was 9.5 billion. Then our debt stock started increasing. The interest component also started increasing. So then when you come to 2014, which is a year of interest for all of us going, you can see that interest payment is that much. You can see emolument is this much. You can see tax revenue as this. When you add this to this and you subtract from the tax revenue, you can see that we are left with very, very small. And that hasn't changed. This hasn't changed, and this will not change because of political propaganda. This is Ghana that we have to be able to do something about. So the most effective way to manage this is to grow your economy inclusively and make sure that you are collecting sufficient tax revenue. So without that, because we can't do anything about this salary emolument and all of that. As part of the IMF program, we had sought to kind of moderate how this goes up. The original program actually excluded health and education. In the implementation, what did we do? And all of that. Okay. So, and you can see that rising over the period. And that tells us that we have to do something drastic, something immediate about this. So you can see that the deficit tends to escalate in an election year. Evidence also suggests that in all the major competitive elections, government's ability to enforce tax compliance is also what? Low, because of the political cost. And that is how come the deficit tend to what? Escalate. So sometimes, of course, everybody cares about job stability, isn't it? Just like the politician. So it may get a little bit terrible for us next year because the political temperature is already very high. And it's as though the election has already started. And politicians also respond to all of that. It's not only the opposition. It's not only the government, the party in power, even the opposition. Okay? So there are some level of defaults in the financial system that you can also trace to. Some people who were hoping to be MPs took loans and it didn't what happened. They lost and lost with the loan. Because I'm sure our political scientists are here. I don't know whether we can choose a democracy without election. Because the way we have operationalized the democracy is highly commercialized and monetized. And I think if we want to deal with corruption, that is where we should start from. We cannot design a system that is so corrupt and expect that system to produce an honest leader. We have to be unique to expect a different outcome. Because what they go through just to win an election, I mean, these are not NGOs. And that's the reality. And I'm sure that is why when it comes to certain corrupt activities, it's like our conscience has gone to bed. Because people have paid. People have paid seriously. And then when you look at the average salary of an MP, and maybe you relate that to the cost they incur in getting there, then it's not so difficult for an MP to ask for something extra, right? And when you are in power, also people continue. I mean, in this country, an MP is as good as the president. He must construct roads. He must be a medical doctor. He must be, I mean, that's too much. Okay. So whilst expenditure has been rising without a corresponding increase in the revenue envelope, we are stretching that envelope further with other what? Initiatives that are also adding to what? To the cost. It is possible that the benefit from these initiatives may not come immediately, but they are also stretching the revenue what? Envelope. And the reason I talked about this is not to say it's not a good initiative, but what I'm saying is that the effect of that, we are feeling that currently. So you can talk about planting for food and what? Jobs. The national building what? Yeah. That is seeking to employ how many people? 100,000, right? Okay. So this is not new. You can go back to the 2016 NDC budget. They also talked about something like this. The good news is that they didn't start it. Or if they did, maybe they have to what? Tell us. So you can see that when it comes to the youth, that there's been some attempt by the various what? Political parties to do something about the unemployment what? Situation in the country. Then again, what did we do? We restored teachers and then nursing training what? Allowances. Of course, that again takes some space away from us, isn't it? I'm not saying it's not a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Okay, but what I'm saying is that this is also taking something what? Away from us. Then we can talk about the Special Prosecutor's Office, which is also a cost center to us, the Coastal Belt Development Corporations, and all these things. And then free what? Free senior high school. Okay, so here we can say it is free, but in economics there's nothing what? Free. Okay, somebody has to pay for it. We have to give up something in order to have this free what? Senior high school and all of that. So perhaps the monies we are spending here maybe could have gone to other, but this is where we have chosen as a country to spend it. But of course, it's also the oil revenue and all of that. You can see a difference between what this government is doing with the oil revenue in terms of the annual budget funding amount, and then what the previous government did in terms of how they allocated it over there. And then you can also talk about one district, one what? One factory. The idea is that in the medium to the long term, we expect that we'll be able to realize some gains from these initiatives. How sustainable it will be, I believe we have to be able to look at it objectively and assess the sustainability of these initiatives over the years. We've had examples like this before. The Presidential Special Initiative, do you remember? One was on cassava. So where are they now? Where are they now? Okay. Thank you. Okay. So these are just graphs to show and all of that. Of course, official development assistance has been decreasing. That is a fact for all of us now. And then we have been doing Euro bonds, and we have been paying in excess of what our fundamentals actually suggest empirically. The African premium so far, we are told, is more than $2 billion and all of that. We have been talking about century bond, green bonds, and all of that. So this was what we showed earlier, right? This is from the IMF, okay? If you look at the current statistics, it hasn't changed that much. This is our country, Ghana. And this is how much we are setting aside, more than 40% of our tax revenue just to service our debts. And then, so I've adjusted this a bit from what it was last year using the rebased tax effort, which is 12.6%, when we should be doing something around 24%, 25%. So the difference between this and 24, 25% is a gap that we have to be able to work hard and close. And then we'll hand that over to Ghana Revenue Authority. Perhaps that may be the terms for appointing maybe the commissioner or so. Give us a plan to narrow this. Is it going to be narrowed in 3 years, 4 years, if you don't deliver? So in terms of efficiency, VAT efficiency and all of that, we haven't been doing a lot, not like the way we should. So in terms of exemptions over the years, we've lost quite a number. I will not bother with you with all of this. When it comes to illicit financial flows, when it comes to a number of them. The leakages in our revenue envelope is very, very huge. And let me also say that it is also consistent with any country that is corrupt. It's also inefficient in collecting sufficient taxes. This is not a work I've done for Ghana. As an academic, I have read, and what I have seen is that any country that is corrupt is also inefficient at collecting taxes. When it comes to property tax, we are told we can do so much, but we are doing so less.